Hi, Kellyanne. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good. It's nice to see you again.
You too.
So, on behalf of the Office of Public Engagement, I just want to thank you for collaborating with us on this small project that we're doing, which is the second version of Just Ask on the Tandem, which is the Office of Public Engagement e-newsletter. And that's on the website. You can find that on the Office of Public Engagement website. So Kellyanne Butler is a Mi'kmaq woman who is an Indigenous education specialist at Memorial University, who is also an adjunct professor in the School of Arts and Social Sciences at Grenfell campus. You also have a long history as an Indigenous Affairs officer, and you're chair of CRIG. Now, I want to see if I get this right. So this is the Committee on Ethics in Research Impacting Indigenous Groups. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here. So the topic that we're talking about today is about respectfully engaging with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous groups. So we know that with the public engagement framework, one of the things that we stress is, the mutual contribution, the mutual benefit, and the mutual respect. And I know that, engagement with Indigenous peoples and groups requires a relationship built on trust. So how can we do that? How do we build a trusting relationship with Indigenous peoples?
That is it's a great question, and it's a really common question. And oftentimes people don't like the answer, but I'm going to explain that I think that one of the things that's really important, especially within an institution, is to understand that we don't all have the same understandings of what words mean. And so sometimes when institutions talk about relationships, in a broad sense, not necessarily talking about Indigenous peoples, but just relationships, oftentimes the default action on that is actually transaction. They're not actually talking about relationships, they're talking about transactions, making an agreement to do something or signing an MOU about something, or making contact with an office and whatnot. But when Indigenous peoples talk about relationships, it is, and not just Indigenous peoples, but specifically Indigenous peoples talking about relationships, it's about it's a back and forth. There's not an end point where it's been achieved. Like, it's something that is ongoing, and misunderstandings then come up when an institution thinks that it's in a relationship with an Indigenous group just by shaking hands or signing something, and the Indigenous group is waiting for that return visit or that ongoing conversation or updates and whatnot. So building respectful relationships and building trust is something that takes a considerable amount of time. And I think that we're doing a lot better across Canada in institutions in terms of trying to understand that. But we're still in a situation where, there's oftentimes some sort of metric that needs to be achieved and reports that have to be sent back. And it kind of puts this pressure on whoever the person is, if it's a grad student or if it's someone in staff position or a faculty member trying to engage with community. Oftentimes there's this pressure that you have to have some sort of product to send back to the institution to justify what you did. And it puts this kind of a rush into, and I don't think it's intentional at all, but it puts a rush into that process. And sometimes we then end up with a transaction and not a relationship. And so I like to tell people to think of it that way, because we all understand what a transaction is. Like, you go in the bank and you make a deposit, you walk away, that's the end. Relationships are different than that. And if you want to do, let's say you want to do some sort of collaborative project with an Indigenous group, collaboration is another one of those words that oftentimes has a different understanding between those two groups. So an institution might have one idea about what collaboration means, and the Indigenous group actually wants like a full collaboration. We're just as involved as you are. We have just as much say-so as you do. And that sometimes makes a little bit of a discomfort because that hasn't been fleshed out. And it's because people just are coming from two different understandings of what that means and a default position in terms of how that's operationalized at the institutional level. So time is the biggest thing that I think people should, consider when they're engaging, when they want to engage, and to actually be always trying to be in relation with Indigenous groups so that when something interesting comes up and you want to engage in an actual project, you already have some sort of a relationship going with that group, whether it was official or not official. When you call them up and say, I have this idea, they already know who you are, and they're not then having to ask you 10 questions about what you do and why you're calling. They already know you.
I see, because you have a relationship established already, so you don't have to go through all that sort of the monotonous routines of who you are and what you're doing and why you're calling.
Yes, yeah. And I think too, from the Indigenous perspectives, oftentimes it's very frustrating to feel that the only time someone wants to engage with you is when there's some sort of funding package in the mix that they're trying to get, or at least the appearance of that to the group. So it's something that I think everyone should be cognizant of is just engage all the time, show up to events. Even just on campus, there are all kinds of, on multiple campuses of the university, all sorts of events that happen that are either presented by or in some sort of collaboration presented by Indigenous peoples, presenting information or histories or workshops. Show up for that stuff. You get to meet people, you'll get to see, they'll recognize your face if they see you again, that sort of thing. Don't wait until you have some specific goal in mind and then call up a community and say, I want to get to know you.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I've been trying to incorporate the word meaningful in between a lot of, or before a lot of words. So like when you were talking about relationship in time, I was thinking about meaningful time, not just time, but like meaningful time. So that's really helpful. Thanks so much. I have another question. What role does cultural competency play in engagement? And I'm talking in terms of like the partner's knowledge of Indigenous history and culture and values and social systems and dynamics. What is the role, or what do you see would be the role of cultural competency in that in engagement?
That's another really good question, and it's very interrelated with the previous one in terms of my answer. But first, I want to just talk about the terminology and the use of this term, cultural competency. And I would use cultural humility as the term. And I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but what happens is, over time we come up with these different terms to use for what it is we're trying to do in terms of, first we might have said cultural awareness, get people aware, how, teach people more. Unfortunately, we don't learn these histories in school, not yet to any substantive degree. So then we talked about cultural awareness, and then those programs started and people started saying, well, when you say awareness, there's no action behind it. People can just say, I'm aware, and so when you then realize, okay, maybe that term doesn't really encompass it, and we're not including the right things when we go around and we try to educate people or put off workshops or symposia, whatever. And so then this moves, I think it moved into like cultural sensitivity for a while. And that still is sort of centering whiteness and asking mainstream people to be more sensitive about different cultures. So still othering people. And then cultural competency does a better job, but it still has this, as it becomes used, you realize it has this sort of finite edge to it that now you're competent. So you've done it. You have this cultural competency, and you go on your merry way. The difference with cultural humility, and this is a term that I think has been around about 20 years maybe, and I think began in healthcare professions. I think it was a couple of nurses that started using this term, but cultural humility is it takes that and makes the person who's seeking that has to have this self-reflection that is continuous, and considers power dynamics and privilege. And so this individual would be continually reflecting on that. How am I, if I'm a mainstream academic or I'm a mainstream grad student, how am I engaging, and what is my privilege and my power? How is that in relation to the people that I'm trying to actually engage with or learn more about? So that Indigenous peoples are not just like subjects of research or education, but are active, dynamic members of society that are interacting with you, and that you have to understand that there's things about you that need to change in terms of the way that you think for whatever reason you have for wanting to learn about this.
Mm-hmm. That's really important, and also really interesting to hear it from your perspective. One last question, if I could. I'm looking at, wondering about the partnership, sort of power imbalances in terms of projects or partnerships and power inequalities, and the importance of Indigenous-driven partnerships or Indigenous-driven research or projects. Do you have any comments that you want to say about that?
I have a lot. I'm sure we don't have time for all of them. This goes back to, again, like, what are the expectations and what are the understandings? Because I've spoken with many people who are engaged in some sort of project, whether it's research or community development, but some sort of project with Indigenous partners, Indigenous groups. And they would describe what they're doing as a full-on partnership. But when you get to the details of what's happening, it's actually everything's been defined by the mainstream university person. And then the Indigenous groups have been asked to come in and participate. And they actually will say sometimes that this is Indigenous driven, but actually everything was defined and the parameters were all set up. And then you inserted Indigenous peoples into that conversation. And sometimes that can be wonderful, and that can be what the community wanted, if that's what the community wants. And this is where proposals and funding organizations kind of mess it all up, because they want whether it's a researcher or the person that wants to engage in community development, they want all that information up front before they tell you that they're going to help you with some funding. They want to know all the different, what are the goals? What's the 4-year plan? How are you reacting to these strategic framework in XYZ? But if you haven't already had the conversations with the community, you can't say what they are. Because the community, if it's community driven, if it's Indigenous driven, they need to do that. They need to be the ones dictating what the parameters are, and you then insert yourself into their framework. And I think that I use the metaphor of scaffolding a lot when I talk, and I know other people do as well, but in mainstream research methodologies, in anything in the mainstream institution, talking about engagement, research, teaching and learning, all of the scaffolding is there. That has been built over generations and generations and generations. And people climb up on that scaffolding and they find their spot, right? And then they take their perspective and their lens on it. And they're going to do their community project differently than the one that did it 10 years ago, but they're basing it on that. They climb up on that scaffolding and then sort of make their own mark. And someone else will climb up on their scaffolding in 20 years. And with Indigenous projects and Indigenous research methodologies, those exist within Indigenous communities, but they don't exist to any great extent in institutions. And this is where we're at a time where one of the responsibilities we have is to make space for that scaffolding to be built. And it has to be built by Indigenous people. And build that scaffolding, hire more Indigenous people, have them at all levels, staff, faculty, governance, and community members come in and help build that scaffolding. And then there's scaffolding that Indigenous people or non-Indigenous people can climb up and find their spot and have a perspective. That's where I think you see that there's a difference then in terms of having something that's a ready-made package and asking Indigenous people to join in versus having something that comes from Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and then emerges out of that. And when we get to the point where we readily accept that as an institution and we embrace that as an institution, that's when we'll actually start seeing far more successful. We have successful projects happening all the time, but you'll see a lot more meaning when you use the word meaningful. You'll see a lot more meaning in those things because there's so much that can happen with you have that synergy that is actual true partnership and not one person sort of dictating the parameters and the other ones just agreeing or disagreeing with them.
Yeah, that's really inspiring. The scaffolding, I have heard that used before, but not at all in this way. So that really brought it to light for me. And I was really able to almost visualize what that process would look like. So really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I think it's really important for students to, get these little bits of information and have some of these questions answered. I have probably about anywhere between 500,000 to about 5 million more questions to ask. But we'll leave it there for now. And next time we cross paths, I'll probably chew your ear off a little bit if I could. Yeah.
I look forward to that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kellyanne.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.